have people coming in, so we'll give it a few minutes to allow attendees to come in. Like we have a good crowd. We're up to 475. Welcome to those that are joining us. We really appreciate you dedicating this time to engage in the conversation with us. So numbers are starting to level off. So I'm going to hand it off to Frank and Chris to open us up.
Terrific. Thank you, Alexis. And I want to start by thanking all of you for coming together at this fraught time for this conversation when so many of us are looking for answers and we're just not finding them. To open things up for our session today, I'm going to ask you to join with me in a moment of silence to honor the senseless killing of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and all those that we've lost as a result of anti-Black racism and police brutality. Thank you. So speaking as a white man, I want to tell you I've come here today to learn how to be an ally. The community that we represent here are the engineering and science enterprise at Harvard, but we're more than that. We're also a community. And in both respects, we can do what we do best, which is to support, to collaborate, to embrace our differences and celebrate our diversity. I'm reminded of something that my colleague Michelle Williams, the dean over in the School of Public Health, recently said. She said that racism is a public health crisis. I couldn't agree more. And in the technology fields, we see that crisis. There are many places you can go to look for guidance on this. Alexis Stokes, our moderator here today, steered me to a very interesting reference entitled Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code by Ruha Benjamin at Princeton. We have thought leaders who are thinking hard about these questions, like how emerging technologies like AI, if not properly managed, can only reinforce and deepen the social inequity. My colleague Cynthia Dwork actually ran a session today on the topic of algorithmic fairness. So this is near and dear to our technological hearts as well. I should say that our event today is prompted by events happening around the nation that are targeting individuals of the African American and African descent. But our lessons from today go far wider than that and aren't restricted to particular communities. And I know we can all remember a month or two ago the very unfortunate targeting of Asians during the early days of the COVID-19 crisis. The strategies and lessons and insights that we learned today, we hope will be relevant to those situations as well. At this point, I want to hand it over to my colleague, Chris Stubbs.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join us this afternoon. We're here today as a community to share, to listen, to learn, and to continue to chart a path to our becoming a more inclusive and respectful community. As Dean of Sciences, I fully embrace the fact that the sciences at Harvard must establish a culture of inclusion and respect, and that we have work to do together to achieve that goal. And I'm asking for your help as we forge that path together. We're honored to have a panel of experts here with us today who can help show us the path forward through their scholarship, their activism, and their humanity. I don't have easy answers, but we're all committed to hearing your concerns, to finding our path together, to identify the next steps. And I welcome your input and I need your help as we move forward. Thank you.
Chris, thank you. And you've been an amazing partner on this. And I want to acknowledge the team that has worked with us, the diversity officers and Cs and the sciences, for their incredible work organizing today's event. Alexis Stokes, who's our Director of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging for Cs. Veronica Diaz-Santana, who's the Administrative Fellow for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging in Cs. Benita Wolf, who's the Equity and Inclusion Fellow for the Division of Science and the Department of Physics. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce as our moderator, Dr. Alexis Stokes. Dr. Stokes joined us in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences almost 3 years ago now through the Harvard Administrative Fellows Program, and was subsequently hired as our inaugural Director of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. Alexis received her BS in Psychology from Xavier University of Louisiana, her Master of Education in Community Counseling from University of Georgia, and her Doctorate of Education, specializing in higher education leadership and policy from Vanderbilt University. She has been an amazing advocate and architect for our DIB activities in Cs, and it's my great honor to let her take over the panel now.
Thank you, Frank. So I want to first again echo the thanks to our panelists and acknowledge that we reached out to them and wanted quick turnaround. We were asking for quick turnaround and participating in an event. And so they all are at their respective institutions dedicated to supporting their community as well. So for them to dedicate time today to support our community, we greatly appreciate. We want to acknowledge that our event today includes undergraduates, graduates, postdocs, staff, faculty, and other members of our community. So this really is a community conversation across stakeholder groups. We don't see this happen very often within higher ed, of all stakeholder groups coming together. So I think that's important for us to call out today. And we have people here who have experienced racial trauma heavily in the past several months, and for some, their entire lives. We have those that are allies who want to support members of our community. So the purpose of today's conversation is to educate, share strategy around the anti-Black racism that we are witnessing and experiencing, particularly within the context of what's happening today in our country, as well as with COVID-19. With that in mind, the strategy portion of today's session, we really want to look to our experts to give us insight at the individual level, as well as the institutional level. We'll open it up for Q&A around 4:50. And so just some logistics of how that will work. You all should see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and have access to submitting questions. You can submit questions anonymously if you would like to do so. The chat function of Zoom has been disabled. The Q&A is visible to us as panelists, however, it's not visible to attendees. And we made that decision due to the sensitive nature of our conversation. And we know that sometimes questions and comments that may come from our audience could be triggering for some of us. So we wanted to keep that in mind, and we didn't want to further trigger or offend anyone. So that is why that portion is viewable to us. We do have closed captioning, so if you click on that closed captioning button at the bottom, you have access to that as well. So I do want to take the time to introduce you to our panelists. So first I want to introduce Dr. Andy Durjai, currently serving as the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Academic Affairs at Northern Kentucky University. He is a native of Atlanta, Georgia. He holds a bachelor's degree in biology from Tennessee State University. He has a EDD from Vanderbilt University, a master's from Loyola University, Chicago, as well as a JD from Georgetown University Law Center. He is also a graduate of Harvard University's Institute for Educational Management. Thank you, Andy, for joining us today. We also have Dr. Tiffany Pogue. She is an assistant professor of teacher education and program coordinator of education foundations at Albany State University. Her research interests include school engagement, Black educational history and philosophy, Black literacy traditions. She earned her PhD in educational studies at Emory University, a master's in African studies from Florida International University, and a bachelor's degree in psychology from Fort Valley State University. She is also an avid HBCU supporter. Dr. Tracy Robinson Wood is a professor of applied psychology at Northeastern University. She's a practicing clinician in New Hampshire, where she resides with her husband, 9-year-old twins, and their lovebirds. Her research is focused on optimal resistance, intersectionality, and racial socialization. She and Dr. Janie Ward are co-authoring Sister Resistors, Mentoring Black Women in College. And we do have one other panelist, Dr. Evelyn Hammonds, and having a little bit of technical difficulties in having her join us, but as soon as we get that resolved, I will do justice in introducing her as well. So first, thank you panelists for joining us. We really appreciate it. And so the first question that I really want to start with for each of you is, like many of us, we are sure you have had a number of thoughts over the last week. So to start our conversation, we just wanted to give you an opportunity to share what are your initial thoughts and reactions around the two pandemics, COVID-19 and anti-Black racism, particularly police brutality, that we are grappling with. And we can start with Andy.
Thank you, Alexis. You know, when we look at the two pandemics that we're dealing with, for me, the first thought process was, it's just heavy. It's a lot of things that are happening one time and a lot of things that are weighing on us pretty heavily. You know, prior to the incidents surrounding George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, we were dealing with the global pandemic of COVID-19. And as African Americans, we were disproportionately being impacted, and we continue to be. And so when you're dealing with that and working through that, to then have it coupled with, you know, this huge national outrage around an issue that's frankly been going on since the beginning of the country, it's a lot, and it's a lot to balance. And so when you're in meetings, you know, as an administrator, one of the things we're tasked with is the response piece. And we start a meeting saying, you know, we're trying to respond to COVID-19, but in that same vein, we say, but what are we doing around our students, our faculty, and staff to make sure that we can be attentive to the concerns of the other major issue going on? And so that's the reason why I think I would say it's just been heavy. It's one of those things that's been weighing on me, weighing on my colleagues. And you feel like it's compounded to the point where you wonder, how do we get out from under it? So that's just my initial thought process.
Tracy, your thoughts?
Thank you, Alexis. I find myself thinking about something that I often say to students when I'm teaching diversity, which is the reign of racism falls on all the houses and land. And so I have had over the years students say to me, you know, that's not true. I'm not a racist. And so I realized that the conversation can become very heavy for students who in their minds have never done anything mean to a person of color, or more particularly a Black person. And yet there is this engagement with racism from birth to the end of life through our major institutions that basically tell us that the culture values certain bodies over other bodies. And that statement in of itself is hard to hear. And yet I am committed as a clinician and as an educator to help people have hard conversations as we prepare clinicians to hold the pain that people are feeling. People are triggered, which means that there is already pre-existing distress, trauma that people feel as a function of chronic racism that happens daily. I call it microaggressions. My professor, Chester Pierce, talked about it as microaggressions, but the extent to which daily Black people are exposed to sometimes covert events that send a message that you are not welcome here, that you are not as smart as white people, that you got into this place, this Ivy League institution or higher ed because of a special favor that was done for you, because you aren't like the others. And so people who have earned their place at the table have to continuously contend with those very unsettling statements or nuances that aren't necessarily overtly communicated, but are still communicated nonetheless. So when you have a COVID-19 trauma where you hear Black people talking about unemployment, you hear people talking about they're not able to pay their rent or feed their children, the trigger is because we've heard those statements before, because that is a consequence of inequity. We call it structural inequality, but the extent to which Black people, Black bodies are differently valued, less valued within the culture. It's a hard conversation to have. So I really applaud leadership here for bringing people to the table to have those difficult conversations. I don't think you can be a Black person or a brown person in higher ed without being Amy Coopered, without having those moments in your life where you are targeted and singled out, and that there's a formulaic way of trying to subjugate you and put you in your place. And so if we can decide that enough is enough, across diversity, we're going to come together to heal, which means difficult conversations, how we're going to make sustainable change. We can do this. I believe in hope, but I also think we have to name the way in which people are triggered, distressed, upset, and oftentimes don't feel safe coming to the table of conversation, because there's a sense of, I hear you, but I'm not going to be changed at depth by what you are saying. And so I ask that if we're going to show up, let us decide we're here to do the work that is sustainable, that we can sustain if we choose to. So I'll just stop there and be able to talk about racial trauma some more later.
And I appreciate your comments around the sustained work. And so we are in a situation now where we have seen a lot of not just higher education institutions, but we've seen companies in industry that were releasing statements in solidarity with their Black students, staff, and faculty and researchers. But there has to be sustained work, and it has to go beyond the words. And I want to make sure we have Dr. Evelyn Hammonds with us. So I want to take some time, a moment, and I will get to you, Dr. Pogue, on your initial thoughts, but I want to introduce our other panelists. She was able to join us. So Professor Hammonds is a member of the faculty in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences here at Harvard. She was the first senior vice provost for faculty development and diversity at Harvard. She also served as the dean of Harvard College from 2008 to 2013. She holds honorary degrees from Spelman College and Bates College. She also serves as the director of the Project on Race and Gender in Science and Medicine at the Hutchins Center for African American Research here at Harvard. She has a PhD in the history of science from Harvard, a master's in physics from MIT, and a bachelor's in electrical engineering from Georgia Tech, as well as a bachelor's in physics from Spelman College. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Hammonds. And where we are right now is our initial thoughts and reactions to these two pandemics. And so I would love to hear from both Dr. Pogue and Dr. Hammonds on that.
Thank you, Dr. Stokes. I apologize. My internet connection is going in and out, so I'm trying to keep up. But my initial reaction to the two pandemics, first, dealing with COVID-19, have the flu. And in a lot of ways, that was my initial reaction to COVID-19 was just fear of what would happen to my community, as a result of disproportionate access to healthcare and things like that. And then for a series of lynchings to occur shortly thereafter became very heavy. And as Andre said earlier, heavy is heavy, and heavy is never meant to be carried alone. And so one of my concerns immediately was, what do we do to create community and to wrap our students in an environment of care and concern, and let them know transparently that we have many of the same concerns that they do. And so again, my initial reaction was just trying to figure out how we come together in forums like this, but also how we reach out to our students individually and provide whatever support that they need in this moment.
Thank you. Dr. Hammond.
Thank you so much. I had a few technical difficulties myself, so I'm happy to be here with all of you to talk about these issues. It is, I hope you can hear me. It's a very difficult time, and certainly for me, starting with seeing the outbreak of COVID in China, as a historian of science and medicine, I knew it was only going to be a matter of time before it arrived here in the United States. And therefore, following that, it was only going to be a matter of time when the virus struck at the most vulnerable people in our population, and for African Americans in particular, because historically we have been disenfranchised with respect to access to healthcare, to vulnerabilities based on the social determinants of health, housing, work, all the kinds of things that would make our people more vulnerable to the virus than many others. So just as the numbers started increasing in March, I knew that we were going to reach a point where we would have a disproportionate impact on our communities. And then, of course, just as we were just talking about, it also became clear that our students were going to suffer a great deal because of this. And that it would be, and all students, in one sense, I would say it this way, everybody's being affected by this. But those who are in families where there's a disproportionate impact of death in their families are suffering in very different kinds of ways as well. So many people are losing grandparents, other members of their families. And it is a time of grieving and mourning. We can't even engage in the rituals we usually engage in to celebrate people's lives. That's a big blow. And then also because of the virus itself, we can't, sort of express our concerns and care for people in our community who are really suffering. Then following that, to have the situation that the incident that happened in Minneapolis just ripped the scab off what was already a festering wound of racism in this country. And now we have to face all of this. It's a lot, it's overwhelming, it's daunting, but I think it's very important for us to be in conversations like this to talk about what's going on.
Thank you. And in that vein, and I want to direct this question to Dr. Hammonds and Dr. Pogue if she's able to join us back, but these two pandemics are so deeply rooted in a history of structural racism. And I'm sure, Dr. Hammonds, there have to be lessons from our past that should be guiding how we move forward right now. So I really want to hear your thoughts on what are those lessons from history that should be a part of our conversation today.
So one of the most important things that I want to say that certainly for African American communities, we can tell a story that begins in 1619 when Africans were first brought to the shores of North America and enslaved, where outbreaks of epidemics throughout from that time moving forward also deeply affected our communities. For the enslaved, it was a time when they had no control over their healthcare or access to healthcare. In freedom, just at the end of the Civil War, the newly freed slaves experienced many outbreaks of epidemics, including smallpox, one that was devastating. But all through those times, I think the hopeful story that we have to tell is the one we've always had people in our communities who are activists and advocates for our healthcare. We realize, I think, for many African American peoples, we have a history of we have to take care of our own. We have to fight for ourselves. We have to bring the care that is necessary to help our community survive these kinds of crises by ourselves often, too often by ourselves. So I think about the women of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority right before World War II who bought cars, packed them up with various kinds of medicines and vaccinations, and drove through the South to places where people had absolutely no health care. And the only reason they shut that project down was that the gas prices got so high as the war proceeded that they couldn't afford to do it. You think about people who built hospitals and nursing schools and medical schools because those institutions were not open to us as a people, though we're citizens of this country. So it's a story where African Americans have disproportionately suffered, but it's also a story of heroic activism and advocacy on the part of leaders in our community on our own behalf.
Thank
And
you.
to add to Dr.
Yes.
Haynes' statement, I think it's important for us to realize that in many ways, the whole story of it has not yet been told, because we know of the formalized activist efforts. We know lesser about family histories. It's so important to turn to the internal history right now, right? So in my own family, both my maternal and my paternal great grandmothers were midwives, and they did a lot in their local communities to ensure that people were well. So if you did not have access to healthcare, just 1 or 2 generations ago, it would not have been uncommon to go to someone in your local community who had some knowledge of health-related protocols for assistance. I think when we think about that, there is a clue to how we might organize contemporarily and in the future around locally controlled, community-controlled efforts to ensure that those people who suffer from disproportionate access to healthcare have healthcare within a phone call's distance. Someone can come. I also think it's important to recognize around the 50s, in addition to those community-controlled efforts for healthcare, there are also attempts by Black communities to co-opt the language of progressivism to ensure the rhetoric around Black education remains such that we were creating citizens for a world that did not yet exist. And so you see in a lot of the letters and teacher journals from that time period, educators meeting with parents about the best ways for parents to support local schools. And in many of those conversations, there are conversations around healthcare. So for our people, for many years, there was no separation between the institutionalized efforts for healthcare and the institutionalized efforts for schooling and equitable access to citizenship. I think when we have those conversations, I'm very pleased to see so many different fields represented here today. We have to be interdisciplinary in whatever approach we choose to take to ensure that all parts of our students remain happy, healthy, and whole.
And I want to pull Andy into this. Andy, you've done a lot of work around civil rights within academia. What are the lessons on the academic side of the house that we need to be thinking about?
Well, I think one of the main lessons is we've got to be able to think about the internal and both external barriers to actually, I won't say achieving racial equality, but achieving equity within the academy. And the reason I say that is that, the internal barriers, and a number of people have alluded to it, the fact that, within our organizations, within our institutions, we have created barriers such that they are barriers to access for African Americans and other persons of color for being successful. If you look at certain populations that have been historically disenfranchised in higher education, you think about, African Americans, you think about women, you think about a lot of different groups that have been impacted. And then you look at the history of higher education and still look at the representation of African Americans in a lot of our higher education institutions. I'm at an institution that's in a metro location where about 15% of our population is African American. 16% of our student population is African American. Of our faculty, tenured faculty, less than 2%. And so when you start thinking about those numbers and thinking about those things, we've got to have a hard conversation, have a hard look saying, what are we doing to promote individuals that maybe don't look like us, don't come from the same background as us, don't have the same perspectives as us, but are vital to the success of our organizations. And so I think, looking internally, that's important. I think the other thing when we start looking at the external barriers, we've got to have an honest conversation about what are the barriers, or what are the weights that African Americans have to carry just day to day. One of the things that was alluded to before was the fact that when I walk into a meeting as the only African American male, or the only African American period of 20 people, I'm the only one who is questioned on their credentials. Why am I in this room, and what gives me the credibility to be able to weigh in and provide insight on a particular issue? And so when you think about that, that's exhausting. On a day-to-day basis, when you have to question whether the concern individuals are having with you is your position you're taking or why you're even in the room. And so if we think about that on a day-to-day basis and think about how many times you're in rooms and you're the decision maker, and people just don't want to support your decision based on the color of your skin, your ethnicity, or your background, that's a huge, huge burden to carry. And so if we're going to be really honest about effectuating change in higher education and our higher education institutions, we got to look at what we're doing from a structural standpoint, but we also have to look at these external things that are going on and how we contribute to them. And so I think if we take a look through those two lenses, we can see success. Now, I'll be honest with you. Do I think institutions are really willing to do that? Because a lot of people play lip service to that. You hear a lot of conversation where you say, you know what, we're going to do this. We're going to hire, Alexis is my good friend, we're going to hire somebody to work on diversity. But when we start having those hard conversations, do we bring the diversity professionals in the room? You know, I'm in a role, and you know my background, having been a chief diversity officer, one of the reasons I moved into the vice provost role was the fact that when decisions were being made, when people were talking about money, they were talking about enrollment, they were talking about the things that really mattered. I want to make sure that as part of our decision-making process, diversity inclusion is part of the process. It's not just a dollars and cents, because diversity inclusion equates to dollars and cents. It's just not an efficiency argument. Diversity inclusion relates to efficiency. And so again, we've got to really think about, is it part of the fabric of who we are, or is it just something we give lip service to put on a mission statement so we don't seem like we're racist and then we're being attacked?
So the strategy that I appreciate everything you said, and the strategy that I want to pull out of what you said was that if we have a commitment on paper to diversity and inclusion, there has to be a commitment in action. And part of that is, one, putting your money to that commitment. And then two, respecting the expertise of that diversity officer to have them in the room when decisions are being made. And so I want to point out that strategy, because I think that's very, very powerful. And Dr. Robertson, what I want to pull you in here, because the things that Andy is talking about right now, of the stress of having to constantly prove yourself in every setting that you walk into, that can cause trauma. And so
Well, indeed.
hear your thoughts on that.
Right. No, thank you. So it's a wear and tear on the body and on the mind. You know, the exhaustion, the doubt, the way in which people begin to question their own abilities, because at some point you begin to, if you're not careful, you internalize some of these negative messages. So the work that I've done over the years is about resistance. How do you optimally resist, push back against those isms that are there? So, sometimes young people are surprised at the way in which they are questioned about their intellectual mettle. They went through a PhD program, for example. They've earned their right at the table, and then to be among peers who question them can be so disappointing and a form of trauma in terms of, why am I being treated this way? Actually, the research shows that the more education you have, the more likely you are to perceive, you know, racial discrimination based on the environments that you're working in. And I think many times people don't realize, white people oftentimes, as well as other people, don't necessarily realize the way in which they are reproducing some of this racist talk with regards to who is smart, who is less capable, and who is most legitimate, irrespective of the kinds of institutions that you've come from. So that wear and tear on the body is real, in terms of it adding to anxiety, to depression, also to lower lifespans, living less long, having certain types of physical and health ailments that you see particularly within, you know, the Black community. So people are deeply impacted by the way in which chronic daily racism is felt. And especially if people don't necessarily understand that that is what you're dealing with. It can impact your sleep. It can certainly impact your appetite, because those can be symptoms of depression. It can mean that people isolate, because sometimes there's a sense of shame that somehow, how did I get myself in this situation? So it's important to be able to name the systemic nature of isms, that this has been going on for a very long time. I put a 1993 image of a cell phone when I teach. And I say to my students, why don't we use a 1993 cell phone? And they say, oh, it won't work. And I say, there's something about racism that works in this country, because the same brokenness that Emmett Till's mother had in 1955 when her child was murdered, that's what George Floyd's family is dealing with right now. This is 60 years later, right? So there's certain aspects of this country that we have to wrestle with in terms of, what do we want to do? We know that there have been tomes written and research studies that have been done regarding how can we make things better for lasting change. Do we have the will to do it? That is what I want to ask, because unfortunately there will be more situations like this that we're grieving now. And what can we do as corporations, institutions, to not just put pretty brown people on brochures, right? And make it sound as if we're in favor of diversity, but really speak to, as Andy was saying, speak to the ways in which we as leaders, administrators can make sustainable change if we want to increase the numbers of Black people on our campuses. Do we have relationships with K through 12 programs to produce a cadre of people who will be part of that pipeline? Because people will say, oh, the pipeline is broken, fix the pipeline. You know, we can do that if we want to. So that, I think, is part of that hard conversations that can be unsettling. And I say to people, it's going to be a bumpy ride. So let's decide to link arms together in a spirit of hope, but also not depend on our discomfort to keep us from digging deeply and trying to wrestle and grapple with some of these issues that really are not going to be helpful for any of us, irrespective of the color of our skin.
And to that point of what can we do, you know, something that comes to mind, and you brought up that research earlier around having more degrees, you know, does not make you immune to anti-Black racism. You're still going to experience it, if not more. And the situation of Christian Cooper, a Harvard alum in New York City, showed us that the attainment of educational and professional success does not erase anti-Black racial bias. And so I'd be curious to hear from Dr. Durajai and Dr. Pogue on how do we work through our own biases? Both of you have done a lot of work around this and educating others about challenging their biases, understanding their biases. And so for those that are striving to be allies and supporters of equity, what can they be doing?
So, you know, what I would say is first calling it what it is and recognizing that it is a bias. You know, the Christian Cooper situation and the Ahmaud Arbery, like many of these situations, are near and dear to my heart because I'm a runner. And so, you know, I get up every morning, and I live in a predominantly white area. And so I get up every morning and run. And so in talking to my wife, she says, what route are you running? And I literally run on the sidewalk of a 4-lane highway. Now, that's probably not a place where you should be running. But as an African-American male, as a 6'4" African-American male, I recognize that anyone seeing me running may very likely not see me as a runner. They don't notice that I have on a running hat, running shoes, and running shorts. They see me as a Black man running down the street. And for a lot of people, that first response is, that's a criminal. That's someone who's obviously done something wrong. But on the flip side, for me, I also have this bias that while I'm running, anyone that says something to me, anyone that looks at me, anyone that I cross at an intersection is potentially someone that's trying to harm me or has plans of harming me. And so for me, I have to come back and say, let me address what my biases are. And I think that has to go both ways. People have to be able to really have a hard conversation and that internal reflection and say, what are these biases I have and what are they based off of? And I'm not saying they're not unfounded because, again, right now in this current climate, you're not going to convince me that people don't want to harm me when they see me going down, but at least I am recognizing so I can think about it. And that gives me an opportunity to start the conversation with other individuals. But I think, again, we've got to really recognize internally what our biases and what those look like. And oftentimes in higher education, because we're all experts in our area, we're not really comfortable saying we don't understand something or we don't know where something comes from. And in our mind, we say, well, it comes from our experience, maybe our superior intellect, but that in fact may not be the case. And so really taking a deep dive and looking, why do I think this way and how does it manifest itself in what I do on a day-to-day basis?
Dr. Pogue, your thoughts?
I think that the key. Yeah, I think that's definitely the key, that internal, constant, consistent reflection on why we make the decisions we make is imperative for anyone who is interested in addressing issues of race. But I also think it's extremely important that we be open to conversations about how even our own language and argument around some of these lynchings, how we're organizing our thoughts. So for example, when we talk about the incidents in Central Park, why does his educational background come up in the conversation? It doesn't make sense. Why does it matter whether or not Ahmaud had a criminal record? It shouldn't. Why does it matter that Breonna Taylor may have once dated someone who practiced illegal activities, allegedly. None of that should matter. And when we engage in the conversations around someone's worth as a victim to brutality, then we are subconsciously saying that only some of us deserve protection and the others of us may be expendable. So even in the bias awareness, we have to constantly be checking our own language and how we make arguments about these things. I think it's also important that we're open to the critique from colleagues and from our own students, right? Because I think somehow when we become faculty or we work with young people, there is the undergirding assumption that we know better. And in a lot of ways, they are closer to this thing than we are. And they have a lot of truth in it. But our own biases about ageism, right, sometimes prevents us from hearing what we need to hear from them. And so I think it's very important what Andrea is saying, that self-reflection piece has got to be there. But we also have to be open and honest with our students. And we have to be ready to have the tough conversations around these issues without victim blaming subconsciously.
So can I just add a point to that, Alexis? So I think it's also really important for the kind of work people on the panel do for us to recognize and articulate as many ways and as many times as necessary that the kind of work that we are pushing for people to do in these institutions, especially in the academy, on diversity, we just represent the beginning of the conversation. It's so many places, it seems to me, once you've appointed a diversity officer, people think that's the end of the story. We have the person who's supposed to take care of it, and now we can just keep doing what we want to do because we really do have it covered. You do not have it covered. And what happens is, it seems to me, that actually in certain respects, it's just a placeholder, just like the language of diversity and inclusion and mission statements. But the intent was never to put forward an action plan that was going to get us from A to B. It's not just the pipeline is broken. Every pathway into and out of the pipeline is broken. We are not making great progress on diversifying our faculties and diversifying our institutions except at the level of students. And so there is so much work to do. But for the most part, many institutions are not really taking seriously the fact that we have to do this work. And I can say something about one of our own institutions. Ask the person in the department, how many students of color have won the prizes for being the best student in your department? And they look at you, they have no idea. How many graduate students have been ranked as the top student in the country with respect to their work who are of color? They have no idea. But they do know who the diversity officer is. But they don't know what's actually happening on the ground in their own departments, in their own labs, in their own classrooms with respect to diversity. And we need to have harder, more uncomfortable conversations to confront that. Because it really has gotten to a moment where the language is seen, the language of diversity and inclusion is seen as an end of itself.
Thank you for that. I 100% agree. And so I want to keep our conversation on the academy a little and talk about, you know, we're saying that we want to recruit and retain more Black and brown students and staff and faculty. So we put it on job descriptions, we put it into mission statements, we make it a goal of a strategic plan. But what are the concrete things that faculty and leaders need to be doing and considering? Because right now we're developing a lot of plans as we move forward for remote instruction and things of that nature because of COVID-19. So what should our faculty and leaders be doing and taking into consideration to create that safer and more equitable learning space?
If I could, Dr. Stokes,
Yes.
just in preparation for it, and then I'm going to defer to my colleagues, just as someone that works in education. My concern is before we recruit a more diverse student body, we need to ensure we are not integrating them into a burning house. And so there is some internal work that has to occur before we try to bring in students, because we don't want, as Dr. Hammond said, we do not want just the checkbox to say we have X number of students of color. What we want to be able to say is our students of color feel welcome here, their work is valued, and that they have the same kinds of opportunities and access to a quality education as anyone else. And so if we have not done that prior work, then asking us to create a system where we can recruit more people of color may be more dangerous than it is fruitful.
You know, I would add, in the student realm, one of the big push right now is this idea of student success. And so it's creating students and cultivating their educational process through the whole life cycle of their education. And so we think about from a model of getting students before they get there, getting them through the program, completing and off to graduation and careers or whatever they're going to do next. But we start thinking about faculty and our staff and our employees, we don't think about that. We think about the recruitment discussion. I mean, we can pull up all the research on how to recruit African Americans, but we don't have anything about how do we retain African Americans? How do we continue to ongoing support African Americans? You know, one of the things that irks me is that during the recruitment process, we're having all these conversations about what are the different people that we can bring in to help, you know, support this individual and recruit this individual and attract this individual to our department or our organization. And when the individual starts, all that dries up. All those people are gone. We're not having those conversations anymore. We're not discussing, you know, all the things we did. And so I think we've got to be very, very intentional about how we build and put in place supports. And, you know, I think to Dr. Hammond's point about we're just in the infancy, because one of the challenges we have is, you know, we don't even have senior Black faculty that we can have serve as mentors in a lot of places. And you just think about it from the standpoint, if I'm coming into an organization, no one looks like me, no one has some of the same lived experiences as me, how do you expect me to be successful? And so I think it goes back to our initial conversation about what do we need to do at the leadership level. And we recognize that we don't have those people. We've got to find a way to build a network so we can support them. You know, if you're at Harvard institution where maybe you don't have the Black faculty in the College of Engineering or the College of Science, but you've got them across the campus, and you need to be intentional about bringing them together across the campus, say, we need you to help create a community for these individuals because we know we have a deficit here. And so, you know, the nature of higher education and being as siloed as we are, we don't think about things like that. We don't think, how do we work across the institution to do that? We say, this is how we do it here, this is how we do it there, this is how we do it over here. And as a result of it, it negatively impacts those individuals we seek to recruit and ultimately retain.
Dr. Robinson Wood, I want to pull you in here because as we are talking about recruiting, we're talking about retaining, that means we have to be responsive to the trauma that individuals are actively experiencing or have experienced. For our campus, you know, as much as we like to say the Harvard bubble, in fact, our community is not closed off to the realities of the world. And so how do we as an institution, but then also if you could pull in the individual aspect as us as colleagues, us as peers, how do we support?
So important to support. And I remember as a young assistant professor, my department chair at the time told me that I was doing too much service because as a new Black female faculty, I was being pulled in so many different directions. And so Black students were making their way to me, you know, oftentimes to talk about experiences that they were having in the classroom or the way in which I could support them. And I wanted to listen to them because I had people who were there for me. And yet if faculty or department chairs or senior faculty don't understand that mentoring of students who come to you because they feel safe in your office, they feel that you listen to them and validate them. If they don't recognize that as vital work, that is the faculty member is doing, or dismiss it as only a service, then that faculty member's work isn't being appropriately valued. So I think that it is the job of faculty, irrespective of your race, to be good mentors to students. And so I think that there are times when some faculty say, well, I don't understand that student's experience, so therefore I'm not well equipped to listen to them or handle, you know, their particular situation. That's an unfair pass. So at the same time, I guess my concern earlier was, I do believe we need to recruit students to our campuses and our faculty. If we wait for those institutions, however, to be beacons of welcome, I question and I wonder and I worry how any of us will get into these. I think microaggressions and racial discrimination are inevitable. And I think that we to find ways to continue to not just hang on by the skin of our teeth, but thrive and find good mentors. I don't think young people should go into these departments, these institutions, without strong mentors who can help them to navigate that racialized terrain, because it is there. And I don't think that the mentors only have to come from the academy. You know, they can come from other sectors of the community, people who don't even have, you know, the education that you have, but they have wisdom and they have ways in which they can help you to make sense out of situations that you ought not be dealing with, but it is unfortunately the way that things are. So I think that administrators need to be more awake to the ways in which students of color and faculty of color encounter discrimination, what that sounds like, how it is not unusual to hear people refer to how it's difficult to find qualified minorities. It's amazing how popular that particular language is. There's this belief that they're few and far between and it's hard to find them, right? And so students hear that. That affects students' sense of welcome, or a sense that you value my intellectual contributions. I also want to put some heat on these professional organizations, such as those organizations that could play a role, licensing boards, for example. You can get, in our profession, in preparing psychologists, they are required to take 3 credits of sociocultural foundations. And that's it. The licensing boards don't require that. You have to take more diversity training, rigorous diversity training, not the feel-good stuff where you're not going to have to dig deep and interrogate your soul, but they don't require it. So you can take that 3-credit class. I got my degree in 1988. There's nothing that requires me to renew for my license any type of diversity work. You're not required, you're not held accountable for knowledge growth and for what it is that you are learning and passing on. How ready are you to provide psychological care for people in need, irrespective of whether they're in a chair or they're from a country outside of this country, or their sexual identity? Where is the requirement that you do your work? And I want to hold professional organizations, they could require that. They require ethics. You know, they may require training in suicidality. What do we care about? And do we have evidence that we're not anti-race, that we're against that? Is there evidence? I think it's not enough to do the pretty pro. Come their ability, staff and students and faculty and editors together engaged in that work is critical, and not, you know, segregating people according to rank. And, you know, because people have ideas that can be shared humanely if we're willing to listen to all folks who are gathered around the table. I think there's a hunger for people to listen, to be listened to, and also to hear. But not everybody is as hungry as others. And so there are people who are willing to come to the table. And I think we need to create spaces for that work to take place.
I appreciate you bringing in the licensing boards and the professional organizations, because many of our faculty and senior leaders sit on the boards of many professional organizations and could be influencing things at that level. And so I think that is a concrete, actionable step that our faculty and our senior leaders could be leveraging their power and privilege to have influence there. And you mentioned that comment around not enough people of color that are qualified. That comment gets under my skin, and I know you all sharing that with me every time I hear it, and especially in being an alum of an HBCU, and I know Dr. Hammonds and Dr. Durjai and Dr. Pogue sharing that with me. I have a contact list of multiple professionals, multiple Black professionals in every field possible. And so whenever I sit in a meeting where someone says that, I almost want to just pull up a Rolodex and say, let me show you the many that are in that field. And so that part is not true. The interest, the question is this a safe environment for them to thrive in? And are our students potentially leaving? And I'll say STEM specifically, because that's where I sit. Are our students leaving because it is not a safe environment for them to thrive in? So I want to start pulling in some of the questions that we have from our audience. And so this first that we have is Harvard continues to have an inward look. So this is a valuable conversation. We're talking about our students, our staff, our faculty, but what can we do to start engaging the neighboring communities, but doing it without a colonial disposition? So how do we engage the greater Boston, so if we're saying Harvard, greater Boston community, and not treat it as though our gates close us off and we don't have to do. So thoughts on engaging the broader community, but again, without a colonial disposition.
So I think one of the ways we do that is again, there are many, many collaborations in the Boston community among many different types of schools that we have. And on this question of diversity and increasing both student, faculty, and staff diversity, we need to be having more conversations with everybody. And I think that's something that has sometimes happened, but it hasn't really been sustained. And I think that the other point is, when we talk about diversifying our faculty population, remember the schools in this area produce a great number of students who go on to graduate school and who go on to faculties. But these schools tend to hire their own. But when it comes to diverse students, we don't see as many. So what I'm trying to say is the focus has to be on the undergraduates in some respect, because if we actually educate a more diverse undergraduate population, we will actually be able to increase our numbers in the graduate population and in the faculty if we pay attention to the pathway to get all these students in the Boston area in a network that is effective and sustainable. So I'd like to ask my white ally friends, again, yes, you might say that you can't find minority staff. You might say you can't find, we have a small graduate school. We can't find graduate students. But if you look around very closely, you can find them, just like your Rolodex, Alexis. They're there, but we're not utilizing those connections in any kind of way that is intentional and sustainable.
Alexis, just as an add-on and as an outsider from the Harvard community, I'm going to do a shameless plug. I helped edit a book called Living the Legacy of African American Education, a model for university and school engagement with Cheryl Croft and Vanessa Siddle Walker. And that book was based on our efforts in Atlanta. We were at Emory University seeking to build stronger partnerships with the local schools in Atlanta. And what we were able to do was use the cachet of Emory's name to enter into these spaces. And we made an agreement and a commitment to one another that we would not go into these spaces as the expert, that we would not go into these spaces to collect data, that we would go into these spaces to be of service. And so when we entered the schools, we agreed with the principals that we are here to do whatever it is you need from us. You tell us what you need. Community members, you tell us what you need, and we'll do it. I think one of the keys when we're talking about community engagement and university partnership is for the university to be willing to accept multidirectional knowledge flow. We are not the sole owners of knowledge. And as long as we're entering the community partnership with that mindset, we'll never be able to build as fully as we can unless we acknowledge that they too have wisdom, they too have methodologies, they too have modalities that we need to learn. And so when we have those conversations about really wanting to engage community, we have to step back and ask ourselves, what is it that we want from this? Do we want to be of service? Or are we just going in to collect data?
And I want to pull in, Dr. Hammonds brought up her white allies. And so we have a number of questions in the Q&A around this of being an ally. And it's a combination of, individuals saying, I am a person in leadership and doing the work of changing the culture of a department or changing the culture of a school is the work of multiple full-time jobs. It's not the work of one person. And so, and then we have someone saying, as an individual, I want to be an ally. I feel I can't go to the protests because of the other pandemic that is happening. So what are the best ways, whether someone sits in leadership or not, the best ways to be an ally?
I'll jump in. I think there's a couple things. I think when we start talking about who can be an ally, what that looks like, I think, we've talked about it, but recognizing those barriers. I mean, that's what we're here for. We're looking and trying to find ways that we can be equitable. And so if you're going to be an ally, I think for starters, you need to be identify what those barriers are, what they're in place, and how you've contributed to them, and then how you can help take them down. Dr. Hammonds mentioned this, and this is one of the challenges. When we're trying to recruit faculty, I'll use that as an example. And so we talk about the recruitment piece, but what about the mentorship piece? Faculty mentoring is a huge thing, and we always talk about it. But when we start getting faculty of color, that goes out the door. And so, when we start talking about we can't find qualified Black candidates, well, what onus is on us to say we've got this person who has potential? How do we bring him up to that level? How do we use our expertise to get them to the next level so they can be successful? And so I think if we're going to be an ally, we've got to be able to build that accountability where we say, what do I need to be doing? Because one of the things that irritates me about the ally comments is people sit back passively and say, what can I do? Tell me what I need to do. You all are extremely intelligent people. You all have done quite a bit of work and are experts in various fields. You can think of things that you can actively do or things that you may have contributed to that have negatively impacted the outcomes for certain populations. And so I think from a starter standpoint is saying, all right, I need to build accountability. I can sit down and say, these are the things I'm going to do. Going to a session and protesting are important and matter. But I think saying, what are some concrete metrics around, the training that we're going to make sure all our faculty have around these things of diversity and inclusion? What are the concrete metrics that we're going to have to say that, every time we have a position posted, we are going to require that a certain number of underrepresented minorities are in this pool. And if it's not, the pool doesn't move forward. I had a conversation with people and we had a position open and it was open for an entire year. And I said, until we can have a diverse pool in this population, we're not going to move forward with this search. And that had people in an uproar. People were upset about it. But when we finally got the candidate that we hired, everyone has said that candidate's been amazing and made an invaluable contribution to our state. But again, it goes back to us saying, what is the accountability we're going to do? What can we do concretely? What are these concrete acts that we can take and things that we can do to ensure that we don't further perpetuate these stereotypes and these racial barriers that currently exist? So if I was talking to an ally, that's the first thing I would say. I want you to go back and have that self-reflection because, coming to a session and saying, I want to stand with you, but I don't see you really putting your mouth where your money is, so to speak, it doesn't do anything for me. And then it just is no different than someone who's kind of sitting on the sideline.
May I just add to what the doctor just said? I think that the ally work is going to be fraught with difficulty. And I think it's possible. There are whiteness studies. There are books on white fragility. There are speakers on, who are not just performing, but who are really speaking legitimately to your white fragility, your white privilege. I've asked my students over the years, what does it mean to be white? What does it mean for you to be white in this country? It's an unsettling question. If you're going to be working as a mental health practitioner with people, I want you to grapple with that question. I also asked them, when you think about the last 3 people you invited to your home for dinner, not just that you ran across the street to Starbucks with and had a cup of coffee, but who were the people in your home and what did they look like? And oftentimes people are the same. They're the same race. They're the same level of education. There's oftentimes somebody within the mix who might be of a different sexual orientation. And it's interesting because I've also found that among my white students, there might be a person of color who is anything but Black, like maybe a person who's Asian or maybe a person who's Middle Eastern, so then we have to think about what is the fear about Blackness here. The other thing I'm concerned about with institutions of higher education is that there's this diversity that is, I call it faux diversity, because it's diversity without melanin. It's ethnic diversity, it's sexual diversity, it's diversity of thought, it's diversity of discipline. It's the diversity of stockholdings, but it's not Black people. And that's the racism that I want to name. Why are we so resistant to bringing in Black people into the campus? And I think it has to do with racism and talking about, I want to talk about white ethnics, But when I talk about white ethnicity, to me, that is ignoring the topic of Black people with respect to the history of slavery in this country. That's a rough conversation. And I don't think we're going to do any service to healing and to trusting each other to have these difficult dialogues if we're going to just go around the periphery and decide that we're going to play it nice and be polite with this fragility. Because I think as Black people, we've often been taught to protect white fragility, not what to say to Black people so that they don't get upset, and that's the way that we've been taught to manage our own survival. And I respect that. I understand that's what we've had to do as a people to get in the door and try to stay in the door. So I'm not mocking that. But I'm also saying that's a stress and a strain on us too, because there's a censoring and there's this gaze that we put upon ourselves to not say anything. Dr. Ward and I were talking about how, our mothers taught us, don't go in there acting like a fool. And so we basically will sometimes, manage our own behavior. And there is a stress and a wear and tear on the body associated with that. And I just want us to try to be as healthy and well and live as long as we can, but also to realize those things that snuff out our lives. And it's important to be able to name that. And to also realize that there are conversations that we're not able to have with everybody, at least conversations that feel safe. And that's the other thing that can be difficult. I've spoken to quite a few Black female academics who are getting calls, from their institutions to speak about, the crisis of COVID-19 and the racism. And they're kind of questioning, what do I say? Do I have the bandwidth to bring up these conversations in a time when people may just kind of nod their heads and listen, but what are you going to do about my vulnerability that I just put out there for you to hear? So people want to have some sense that we're not just going to try not to look bad, but we are committed to being transformed at depth, to be changed at the root if we really care about all of our kids, all of our people, all of our citizens.
And I think we all sharing that with you, Dr. Robinson Wood, that we all had that speech from our parents to not go in there and act a fool. And specifically, sometimes it may have been, don't go in there and act a fool in front of those white people, because we were concerned with their white fragility. And, it made me think back to Andy's comment on when we started of calling it what it is. And so not only are we hesitant to bring in Black students, staff, and faculty, we are hesitant to say the word Black with a capital B, and to call it that and say, so we say people of color more than we call out when something is specifically impacting the Black community, or is it specifically impacting the Latinx community. There is value in us calling that out and being very specific in the community that it's impacting as well. And so I want to pull in a question, because you brought in the concept of, is it safe for me to be honest? When you ask me to speak, when you check in with me over these last few days, many of us have probably gotten emails from colleagues checking in, and I hope you're doing well and taking time for yourself right now. And is it really safe for me to respond to that honestly? And I think if we were being honest with ourselves, we say that academia has created a culture of silencing, especially if you are a staff member or you are a student. You do not feel you have the space to be honest in that time. So what can we do as institutions? Because it's easy to say, speak up, but am I safe to do so? So how do we create that safe environment to speak up?
So I think this is a moment where leadership is really important. And I think that it's time, there are lots of people writing lots of commentary right now, and as you said, colleagues expressing concern. And I think, people have nothing to lose right now, I think, in terms of expressing themselves and trying to be as honest and direct as possible. If not now, when? And so, yes, people call and they say, how are you doing? How are you holding up? And I'm like, well, how are you feeling? It's your people who are engaging in some egregious acts. How are you feeling about that? You can flip the script. It's not that we are to be called because of an explicit sense that we are suffering The people who are engaged with suffering, who are other white people who see other white people right now engaging in racist behavior, ought to be concerned about their people. And I think it's really important. You know, if you don't want to talk, I think for people of color, for African Americans, if you don't want to talk to people about this, if you don't want to share, you have a right to do that. You also have a right to take up some space and say, look, this is not the time for Black people to assuage the feelings of white people. This is the time for white people to take responsibility for what other white people are doing in the name of whiteness and white supremacy. And that's what's the hard part. That's the part that says many of our allies who might say, well, me personally, I'm not, well, you need to think harder about that. You need to think about the things that you do every day that supports a system that has disenfranchised Black people. And I'm in Zoom meetings, I've been in Zoom meetings all day. And you look on the Hollywood squares, and you can see so clearly, I'm the only Black person in the room. I should not have to be the one to raise what's happening in the streets of America today. It's not my job to do it. It's just not my people who are suffering. America is suffering, and folks need to take ownership of that. And in a couple of meetings, I'm like, I had to think, is this what I want to bring up? Some meetings I did, some meetings I didn't. Not because I didn't feel safe, but just because it's not my job to take care of other people right now. It's my job to take care of the people I care about and the people I know who need my support and my help, especially students who are having a hard time thinking about what this moment means for them.
So to end that of actionable things for people to be doing, I want you each to provide a suggested reading material that if someone wants to learn more, because to many of the points that you have made, the burden should not fall on Black people to teach others about anti-Black racism and about the actions that they should be taking. So I want from you a suggested reading, and then with that, an actionable thing. Resources, you have unlimited resources at your disposal. Based on the data that is before you in the work that you do, what is the top priority that you would speak to institutions, to leaders, to say, this is what you need to prioritize right now? And I'll start with Dr. Durajai.
So Dr. Robinson Wood already alluded to it. If I had to say a resource, White Fragility, great book, great read. I think it's very, very helpful, very, very useful, and some strong takeaways for anybody who's really committed to doing this. When you said if resources were unlimited, being somewhere where they're not unlimited, that was tough for me because, you proposed Christmas. So what I would say is, I'll think about the realm of where resources aren't unlimited. And what I will say is, I think one of the things that's very, very important that we have to think about is communication and how we communicate matters. One thing that I like that your dean started with is you've got to name these individuals. We can't be in the space where we say, we promote diversity and inclusion and welcoming individuals from all backgrounds. We've got to say what's actually going on, what it is, and name it. And I think we've got to consistently communicate that. It can't be only when there's an issue. It can't only be when we're responding to something. It's got to be part of our consistent communication as an organization, as an institution, as a department, on a continuous loop. If we say that every week we're communicating something to the entire campus and it's talking about a number of aspects of inequities and how we're working to resolve them, I think that can go a long way with sending a strong message that we're committed to it. But if we only mention it when there's an issue, we only admit it when something, hits the news, when someone's killed, that's the only time we're having these sessions, that doesn't really show that we're committed to it. It shows us that we're being reactive and we're responding because we have to, and it makes us look bad if we don't. As opposed to constantly having this conversation ongoing, getting 500-600 people together to listen. I think that'd be really big. So if I was thinking about one thing I could do is making sure that this is part of what we do, not part of what we do in reaction to something, but part of what we do proactively as being, who we are as an institution.
Thank you. Dr. Pogue.
Yes, so my suggested reading would be Too Much Schooling, Too Little Education by Imwali Mushujai. I think that's a phenomenal book, and I would recommend that read to anyone. In terms of what I think is a practical strategy, is for all of us to take whatever white papers, mission statements, and policy statements that exist for our individual units and sit down and operationalize them, create rubrics from the language, and ensure we're doing what it is we say we are doing.
Thank you. Dr. Hammonds.
So for me, I am reading James Baldwin and I'm reading Toni Morrison. And my suggestion is James Baldwin, The Evidence of Things Not Seen. I think he speaks cogently and brilliantly to the situation that was so visceral for him during his lifetime and is still visceral for us. And he's unflinching in his analysis of what white supremacy actually is and what it does to people. So I vote for, I would recommend James Baldwin. And concrete things, I think this is a moment that we have to see both as crisis and opportunity. And in higher ed, for me, it says something very clear. If we get into conversations about what's required of our students to be considered educated people, the fact that in the United States, we do not absolutely require every single college student to take US history and learn about how racism became so deeply institutionalized in the United States. And once we can get students, every student needs to understand that history, the debate, the problems, the challenges, and the successes. Because we can't have these hard conversations because a lot of people simply don't know anything. And that willful ignorance has got to stop. And I think we should take this opportunity to say, it has to stop now. It simply has to stop now.
Thank you. Dr. Robinson Wood.
Thank you. I would recommend Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. I just showed my intersectionality team. We watched a video with this dynamic clinician, Vanessa Jackson, who basically how activists were dealing with political depression. And so it's the politics of healing, creating a clinical space for activism in Trump era. And also that healings are important for people. I think white students need circles where they can address their white privilege and their white fragility. I think faculty and administrators need the same circles where they can read White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, or they can look at work by Tim Wise, where they can be educated by other white people if they wish to tackle these kinds of conversations. Because sometimes you can read a bit of a book and then come back and be, as one of my friends says, even more creepier than ever, because you've read just a little bit and you haven't digested the information and you're kind of all over the place. But what would happen if people gathered on a regular basis to unlearn, to learn the history of racism in this country? I have honor students. I ask them, how many of you can name 5 inventions of Black people? These are the best and brightest at the university. Nobody raises their hand. I said, how did that happen? Nobody taught you, right? You can learn that. You can go out and find it. And so, but what does it mean to go through high school, be an honor student, be the best and brightest, and you can't think of anything that Black folks have invented? What is your relationship to Black people at that point if you think that they haven't done anything worthy of knowing about? So I think that is a space where these kinds of hard questions can get, that people can grapple with, and maybe do it in a space where they can begin to confront some of their own shame, some of their guilt and some of their pain. And I love what Dr. Hammond said in terms of thinking about what your people are doing to other people based on the color of their skin, and that shouldn't be a burden only certain people bear. And because as I saw with one young person showing a sign at the protest, she said, white silence is violence. It is.
Thank you. And we will make sure to get the names of all of those books to all of our attendees if you weren't able to write them down, and we will provide links. And so even if they are available for free for download via the Harvard Library, we will send you that link. So we are removing that barrier that you can access it there. I'm in the interest of time, and I want to bring back Dean Doyle and Dean Stubbs to close us out. But before I do that, I want to share with our attendees opportunities for them to continue to engage. So of course, the nature of this event doesn't allow us to engage at the level that we really need to be engaging on this topic. So I'm going to quickly share my screen to show you opportunities moving forward for Cs and for the Division of Science. And there will be many more opportunities that will come for across Harvard. So this is only a small portion of what will be available to you, but Cs will be hosting a People of Color coffee break on tomorrow at 4 o'clock. This is an opportunity for those of marginalized identities to come together to support each other and to help process what we are experiencing right now. We have been having a book club for the last, really since we're working remotely, and we're reading The Privileged Poor by Tony Jack. And so we also will be taking into consideration these recommendations from our panelists of what we read next. And we will have an event on the history of Juneteenth, so keep an eye out for the invitation to that, as well as open office hours with myself and colleague Veronica. And these resources will also be put into the chat for you so that you have access to these links. You can also set up one-on-one check-ins with us. The FAS Science Department, they have a talk with Professor Jack on Thursday. So I encourage everyone to log on to hear what he has to say and his expertise in this area of serving students as well and being a support to them, as well as one-on-one sessions with Benita, the Equity and Inclusion Fellow within the sciences. So I encourage each of our members of our community to engage in some way. There are also trainings that Cs announced a couple of weeks ago with regard to how to be an ally and evaluating your bias, as well as calling out versus calling in, because it is time for us to all be speaking up and calling our colleagues and our peers out, or calling them in on the things that we are seeing them do or the things that they are saying as well. And so I'm gonna bring back Dr. Dean Doyle and Dean Stubbs. Ask them to turn their cameras on, and they should appear on our screen.
It is not letting me do that, Alexis.
Not sure why that is. So it should let you do it now. Let's see. Chris, are you able to?
No, I don't know. If you hover over my image, I think you might be able to start my video. Oh, here we go.
There we go.
Ah, there we go. Excellent. Of course, the Dean of Engineering struggling with the tech. Look, can I ask everybody online here to please share a virtual round of applause for our organizers and our amazing and inspirational panel. It really has just been, for me, just absorbing and engaging a conversation here. I have to say, I have learned so much about practices that could make me a stronger ally. And as many people pointed out, and I saw it in the chat box, it's not some passive, comfortable position. It's a position of action. That's what's being required here. And Andy, I think you're spot on in pointing out that this has to be sustained. This isn't a one-up at crisis time. And I want to tell you, I'm committed, and I know my partner Chris is committed to doing this as well. The last thing I want to say is, when we were in our private session before this all started, I hope she doesn't mind, but I'll share that Dr. Robinson Wood had mentioned that solace might be the kind of thing that we would draw from a conversation like this. And so I hope that all of you feel that this event has brought you some measure of comfort, but at the same time, I hope it energized many of you, and I hope it energized you to join Chris, Alexis, Benita, Veronica, and myself to take action, because we're ready to partner with you and do that good work. Chris, over to you.
I just want to reiterate what Frank said. My thanks to the panelists for a discussion that has at least brought us some step forward in understanding the challenges that we face. I want to reiterate my personal commitment to continuing to work in partnership with colleagues on the hard work to transform Harvard as an institution. It's tough. It is hard to bring about institutional change. I am determined to do everything I can while I hold my position to move us down that road as fast as I can manage. But I cannot do it without my colleagues in the institution identifying what you can do on a daily basis, concrete actions. Those of you who serve on admissions committees, those of you who serve on search committees, those of you who help shape us as an institution, we are Harvard. And I look to you to help us move forward and get to where we need to be. So I just thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I know this is just a shocking moment. COVID has shocked us, the world. And I think the country is suffering through another shock. And the good we can bring out of that is to stop and think right now about actions that we can take to bring about sustainable change. And I thank you for your help in that regard.
Thank you, Dean Stubbs and Dean Doyle. And I just want to echo the thanks to our panelists, Dr. Pogue, Dr. Hammonds, Dr. Robinson-Wood, and Dr. Durjai. I owe you so much for coming on. It's such a last minute. I greatly appreciate it. I have many notes of the tasks, the things and the recommendations that I will not only be continuing that conversation with Dean Doyle on, and I'm sure Benita will be continuing that conversation with Dean Stubbs on what are the things that we can put in place. And I recognize that we asked you to come on and to speak on these things at a time that each of you are also trying to process. And you are also trying to understand what is happening to our community right now. And I don't want that to go unnoticed, that each of you are Black and a part of this community. You are actively experiencing the trauma of being inundated with images of people that look like you, that are being killed in the streets and that are being attacked. And so I thank you. And we know that the work should not fall all onto our shoulders. So I appreciate you dedicating that time to each of you. I thank each of you still at 5:37. And so the fact that we could engage over 500 people for an hour and a half says a lot. So I thank each of you for joining us today. Please stay tuned for future events and opportunities to engage with us, some on a smaller scale, some on the same scale. And hopefully when we are able to come face to face, we will continue that conversation face to face on campus as well. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Alexis.